What do you think is the most important trend we've seen in American climate and energy policy in recent years?
Well, we've seen a lot of changes in American climate change policy over the last 2 decades. We've seen a lot of investment in the science. We now understand the science of climate change much better, so we're able to make more informed decisions about adaptation and a resilient economy. Also, we have seen a new generation of mitigation technologies being developed and being tested, and they're moving to the field. And we've seen some big trends in natural resource management. For example, we've seen an explosion, if you will, major growth in the supply of natural gas. And so we've seen tremendous fuel switching from coal to natural gas in our power plants and in our industry. And we've seen reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions profile. So there's been a lot of changes in the science, the technology, the fuel supply. And of course, each president over the last few decades has been grappling with this issue, trying to work with the Congress to carve out and to maintain a coherent climate change strategy. Interestingly enough, many of the states have stepped up, the individual states, and of course they're the crucibles of testing the new policies and such, but we've seen a lot of creativity in different American states. The new AB 32 climate change law in California and other laws and leaders in climate change. So we're seeing it's a time of change, a time of evolution, and hopefully a time of resilience in trying to cope with the challenges of global climate change.
And do you think that America's switch to natural gas will help it to achieve its long-term climate goals?
Well, the early trends are, looking over the last decade, when we've seen a significant amount of switching from coal to natural gas, that we've seen a concomitant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. America's greenhouse gas emissions profile has decreased a little bit more than 10%, and that's a good trend, and I think the fuel switching has been a contributor to that. Certainly there have been adjustments in other policies, different transportation policies and such. But yes, I think that the gas trend is real, and presumably we're going to be able to explore for new gas supply, harvest this gas, move it into the economy, and it's a relatively clean fuel, and it's relatively cheap and inexpensive supply right now, and we have the infrastructure to move it around within our economy and to sell it to our neighbors and friends around the world.
Lots of countries are now trying to replicate the US experience in natural gas. Some countries like France have imposed a moratorium on it, and in the UK and other countries there's a great deal of opposition. Do you think that this experience can be replicated in other countries, and do you think that some of the opposition is at all justified?
Well, each country is going to have to identify its own pathway forward to cope with climate change, and we want to respect the decisions taken by sovereign parties to the Climate Change Convention. But certainly there are other countries, China comes to mind, whose natural resource base is a little bit similar to the United States. I mean, China has abundant coal. They're also now discovering abundant supplies of natural gas. And you're seeing the Chinese are beginning to look at the opportunities to switch from coal to gas to cope with their greenhouse gas emissions, as well as their very challenging local air pollution issues. There are others around the world who have a good supply of gas, and they'll make their own decisions about how they want to cope with their greenhouse gas emissions. But UK, France has got, of course, a strong base of nuclear power supply, so they have a low emissions option, which they're managing very carefully and prudently, and it's a good solution for them. But I would say overall, looking at all the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, one size does not fit all. Each country will make its own set of decisions, which are in its best economic, environmental, and its own security interests.
Under the UNFCCC, the US and China are really going to be the two powerhouses of this new agreement. Do you think, from your work, that their positions are becoming more reconciled?
Well, China and the United States have endeavored to work very closely on climate change, and maybe it's one of the not very well known, but there's an active dialogue between the China and the United States in trying to sort out their climate change policies, identify areas of common understanding, common pathways forward, common policies, working together on technologies, and a lot of cooperation. And as the new landscape of the climate change agreement becomes more apparent, I think that China and the United States will continue to work together and show leadership in this arena.
What shape do you think the new climate deal will need to take if it has a realistic chance of being successfully implemented?
Well, it's a little bit early to say. We're still more than a year and a half away from the Paris meetings to deal with the new climate agreement in 2015. But a few years ago, here in Mexico, by the way, here in Cancun, here in this facility, an agreement was taken that, in fact, nations of the world would work together. Everybody would make a contribution, a contribution to solving a global challenge. And I'm hopeful that we'll begin to see pledges emerge from parties to the convention, and that these pledges for mitigation actions and adaptation actions will add up to something significant and that will be effective at scale in dealing with the size of the challenge of global climate change.
And are you hopeful that the summit that the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, is going to host in September will be a positive step where world leaders can start to deliver some pledges of action on climate change?
Well, I hope so, and I think so. I'm personally involved in trying to prepare for the summit in September in New York, and we are encouraged. A lot of thought and planning is going into the event, and I think nations of the world are beginning to take stock of what they can bring to New York, how they can express it. So I'm enthused and excited about the opportunity to be a part of that summit and to make a contribution. But at the same time, learn and observe what others are doing, and hopeful that it'll add up to something big and significant and provide momentum going into the 2015 agreement.